This chapter deals with the source of virtues. At the beginning, Aristotle says, virtue then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral, intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, whence its name ethike is one that is formed by a slight variation in the word ethos, or habit. From this, it is also plain that none of the moral virtues come to us by nature. For nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. This last bit might sound strange. What's he getting at? He provides us with a nice illustration. Take a rock, throw the rock up, do it again. How many times do you have to throw the rock up before the rock can do it on its own? It never will. As far as nature alone goes, a rock will only go downward. That's its nature. Because of the way nature works, it's not nature that produces virtue in us. Rather, he concludes, neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and they are made perfect by habit. As the chapter proceeds, we'll get more analysis of what virtues are and how they work. Aristotle will provide us with several examples of virtues in this and the next books. Here we see that the acquisition of virtue requires purposive activity. It is a virtue that can be taught. Some degree of rationality, some degree of intentionality is required in the teacher and in the student. Learning is not all on the teacher either. Students must take up the pursuit of virtue for themselves. It takes focus and work to gain a habit. Chapter 2 begins the discussion of how virtues are defined and determined. At 1104a, line 11, he writes, first then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. Exercise, either excessive or defective, destroys the strength. And similarly, drink or food, which is above or below a certain amount, destroys the health. Well, that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. That's the general framing. Deficiency is a problem. Excess is a problem. Too little or too much of whatever is in view makes for the bad, the vice. As Aristotle works his way through a list of virtues, he will examine each in terms of the problem of deficiency and excess. At the end of the chapter, at 1104a, line 33, he says, by abstaining from pleasures, we become temperate. Two essential things that aren't entirely clear yet. First, Aristotle is not against pleasure. He'll argue that pleasure has a place. Our problem is when pleasure and pleasure seeking is in control of our lives. Second, we'll see that being temperate is very important to Aristotle. One who is temperate chooses the right things for the right reasons, not merely because they are pleasurable. Well, we'll see that there is more to temperance later. At chapter 4, 1105b, line 5, Aristotle writes, actions then are called just and temperate when they are such as the just or temperate person would do. But it is not the person who does these that is just and temperate, but the person who also does them as just and temperate persons do them. The claim here is that the just or temperate action, and we could put other virtue terms here also, it's not just a matter of what is done, but how the action is done. There's also a circular evaluation going on. We continuously evaluate the acts, the person doing the acts. We seek justice, temperance, and the other virtues in the actions of people, but also in the whole life, the character of the person. When we cover egoism, we'll see the claim of psychological egoism. This is the descriptive claim that people always act in their own self-interest. Sure, many will deny it. Many will tell nice stories explaining that they are not acting out of self-interest, but the defender of psychological egoism will see these as empty defenses. From what I see here in Aristotle, Aristotle would not adhere to the psychological egoism thesis. A person who is truly just does the just thing out of a character of justice. Self-interest is not a factor. Of course, you might come back at Aristotle for being disingenuous when you read his account of the virtue of megalopsuche. Here in chapter 5, Aristotle focuses more intently on defining what virtue is. He says, since things that are found in the soul are of three kinds, passions, capacities, states of character, virtue must be one of these. Here we are digging around in the soul, and we discover there are three kinds of things. There are passions. The Greek word is pathe, from which we get our English words pathos and pathetic. There are capacities. The Greek word is dunamis, from the same root that we get our words dynamic or dynamo. And there are states of character. The Greek here is hexes. I'll let you imagine English words we get from that root. It's a little less obvious than the others. Thinking of heck instead of hex might help you a bit. Virtue as something in the soul must be one of these three, according to Aristotle. Aristotle first rules out the possibility that they are passions. At 1105b, line 29, he says, we are not called good or bad on the grounds of our passions, but are so called on the grounds of our virtues and our vices. Our possession of virtues must be the kind of thing by which we are evaluated as good or bad. So far, his judgment isn't helping much, but he adds another step. At 1106a, line 4, we see that virtue involves choice. Passions don't come from choice. They just happen. Passions move us, whereas with virtues, we are disposed or inclined in a certain way. What about capacities? Could it be that virtues are capacities? For Aristotle, we have capacities, but we don't have virtues by nature. So virtues must not be capacities. By this reckoning, then, there is only one possibility left. Virtues must be states of character. What sort of state of character is virtue? Here in chapter 6, he says, every virtue or excellence. Let's pause right there. The Greek word arete can be translated virtue or excellence. We get both words here, not because Aristotle put the word twice, but because the translator is helping us understand this. Okay, let's go back. Every virtue or excellence both brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence and makes the work of that thing be done well. Aristotle helps us figure out what that means by providing a couple of examples. The excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its work good, for it is by the excellence, the virtue of the eye, that we see well. Similarly, the excellence or virtue of the horse makes a horse both good in itself and good at running, and at carrying its ride, and at awaiting the attack of the enemy. I notice a few things here. First, I see again the importance of teleology for Aristotle. What's the eye for? What's a horse for? What's its purpose? What are their respective purposes? Virtue or excellence relative to each is what makes it able to achieve its purpose, its end, its telos. I notice a second thing, particularly when it comes to the horse. As far as this example is concerned, the purpose of a horse is to be good at running, carrying its ride, awaiting the attack of the enemy. Does a horse not have any purpose other than as a tool of human intentions? Maybe that's where the line good in itself comes in. Perhaps a horse can be bad at running, unable to carry a ride, and totally ill-equipped to serve in battle, but still be a good horse. But how might we understand that purpose? The third thing I notice, Aristotle has mentioned before, this chapter is over, that virtues are not passions or capacities because they neither simply happen nor are they facts of nature. They involve reason and choice. If this is the case, how can we speak of the virtue of something like an eye? Does an eye have reason? Do eyes make choices? Does an eye have a purpose independent of the being of which it is a part? Continuing in chapter 6 at 1106a, line 26, Aristotle begins an aspect of virtue that will frame his discussion of particular virtues over the next several chapters. In relation to all things, it is possible that there is too much, an excess, or too little, a deficiency. Vice, the opposite of virtue, is found in either in excess or in deficiency. Virtue is found in the intermediate position, the mean, the midpoint between too much and too little. At the point where 1106b transitions to 1107a, we see Aristotle summing up what he said in this chapter. Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, that is, the mean relative to us, this being determined by reason, and by that reason by which the person of practical reason, and remember that's the word phronesis in Greek, would determine it. With regard to anger, also there is an excess, a deficiency, and a mean. Although they can scarcely be said to have names, yet since we call the intermediate person good-tempered, let us call the mean good temper. Of the persons at the extremes, let the one who exceeds be called irascible, and his voice irascibility, his vice irascibility. And the man who falls short, an unirascible sort of person, and the deficiency unirascibility. I noticed that my spell checker doesn't know the word unirascibility. I confess that's a new word for me too. Aristotle is giving us an example of what he's talking about with the idea of the mean, the midpoint between excess and deficiency. If anger is a response to a frustration of some sort, we can over-respond, under-respond, or get it just right. When our anger goes overboard, when there's an excess, the characteristic we're exhibiting is irascibility. If we're in a situation where we ought to be angry, but we're not, then the characteristic we're showing is unirascibility. If we get it just right, appropriately angry, but no more, we exhibit the characteristic, the virtue of good temper. Have you thought this way about anger before? About the possibility that anger might not only have a purpose, but that purpose could be such that the way we express anger could be conducive to that end or an impediment to that end? When you look at your peers or at the culture at large, how do you think we're doing at this virtue of handling anger well? Consider what Aristotle says at 1109b, starting at line 2. But we must consider the things toward which we ourselves are easily carried away. For some of us tend to one thing, some to another. And this will be recognizable from the pleasure and pain we feel. We must drag ourselves away to the contrary extreme, for we shall get into the intermediate state by drawing well away from error. Two things here. First, we'll see at various places the important role of pleasure or pain. Pleasure draws us close, pain pushes us away. Too much attention to pleasure or pain can drive us to the extremes of too much or too little of whatever state of character is in consideration. Second, when we employ our perception and reason, we can come to the conclusion that we are not at the midpoint. We make a choice that we want to move toward the mean, toward the point of virtue. We want to move away from where we are, mired either in excess or deficiency. To make that move, we need to aim not at the mean, but at the opposite extreme, or so Aristotle says here. By aiming at the opposite extreme, we move that direction. The obvious challenge then is to recognize when we have moved far enough and are occupying the mean, the intermediate state between excess and deficiency. What do you think of this advice? Or do we take it as advice? Might we take it instead as a description of how things actually work? What do you see here? A descriptive thesis or a prescriptive, normative thesis?